coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
There's essentially this value question where America sold its industrial base to China starting in like the mid 90s in exchange for like an endless flow of like Temu products, garbage, like plastic crap. And everybody knows this. Everybody's house is filled with literally just what's that word for the
Langes?
no pH
Phthalates.
yeah. Like everybody's off gassing phthalates or whatever they are. There's something sick about it. Now, okay, Trump, yeah, it sounds a little weird for him to come out with some kind of crunchy viewpoint on consumerism, but that's essentially what it is. I mean, that's what he's saying. He's like, well, we don't really need as much garbage as we've been buying.
Hello, and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I am your host, Spencer Clavin, associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books and Give Send Go editor of the American Mind. I am joined this week by managing editor Mike Sabo, publisher and president Ryan Williams, and back once again by steady stream of ever popular demand, our regular correspondent, Seth Barron. And we've got lots to talk about. There was a significant Trump interview over the weekend to mark and cap off his first 100 days in office. He went on Meet the Press on NBC and talked to Kristen Welker, whom some of our listeners may remember from a couple of the debates. She moderated one of the 2020 debates and also the third 2024 debate, if I'm recalling that correctly. And she had a good, solid sit down interview with him. Trump, I think, just loves this sort of thing. He really, he seems to feel in his element. I think one of the things we'll discuss is whether, in fact, he was in his element, whether he's doing himself favors here or not. But he loves to lock horns with these guys, and I don't think he's really had any worthy adversaries in a while. He's had more control over the press briefing room. Obviously, that's been much discussed. But more generally, I think the press is a bit chastened, much like the Democrat Party, since they're basically the same thing. They haven't been coming after him in the same way. And one remarkable feature of this interview, I thought, was the total absence of 90% of the major attack lines that for the last decade have been part of the Trump hate fest. There was plenty of negativity and plenty of antipathy between Welker and Trump, but Trump has just completely reset the narrative to the extent that now the accusations that are made against him, the only one that sort of remains from OG Trump 1 is this idea that we're sliding into authoritarianism or autocracy. But you got none of the Russiagate stuff. The investigations have just completely vanished from the press's consciousness, probably because they worked out so badly for Trump's opponents. That all having been said, and noting that as these things go, I thought Welker she obviously was no Trump fan, but she could have been more aggressive than she was. So relative to how these things tend to go, I thought it was a pretty low grade, cool interview on both sides. There are some significant exchanges in this interview. And I'm going to stipulate at the outset that listening to Trump talk for an extended period of time is always just such a revelatory experience. He has such a bizarre and idiosyncratic way of speaking that seems to require such unblushing confidence at every turn that you're kind of constantly developing a theory of mind for him as you go. He's forcing you to always be guessing like what's going on underneath all the bluster. So that in itself is just kind of riveting. And I did think there were some interesting tells that happened here. The first one is about tariffs. So obviously this is Trump's most high profile and most vulnerable area right now is these tariffs that he's imposed and some of the exceptions that he's made and his new focus in particular on China. And he basically said in this interview, we've all but cut off trade with China by imposing these huge tariffs. And Welker was kind of trying to get him to say, like, are you going to scale those back? Are we going to get the goods back from China? And this led to one of Trump's most infamous lines, which he repeated here, which is that like girls don't really need 30 dolls. They can have 3 dolls. You don't need 100 pencils. You can have a couple pencils. And what's interesting to me about this is this struck me as just not a good look for him when he first said it. And listening to him kind of spin out this idea in exchange with Welker over time, I realized that he's actually kind of working his way subtly to a slightly different version of this argument. It started out, it really was very Bernie Sanders coded. It was like, do you really need so many different kinds of sparkling water, comrade? But now it's kind of turned into, he seems to be working his way towards saying, you are emphasizing in the press these sort of minor goods and that are up in price, like strollers and things. But you're not focusing on these major components of the economy that are doing well, like gasoline, for instance, prices going down in these more important areas. And so he's kind of turning this into an argument about the pain of the transition and say basically trying to say we're going to give up some stuff that we won't miss in exchange for some stuff that we're going to be really glad to have. Now, I'm not going to say that that was always his thesis. I'm not going to say that it will continue to be his thesis tomorrow, but I thought it was kind of interesting that that is how he's very subtly adjusting his version of this sales pitch on tariff. Now we can talk about whether that's true, whether in fact that's going to work for him, whether it's all kind of a negotiating tactic or what. I don't think Welker really had any success in nailing him down on any of those enduring questions. But that part was interesting. He neglected to commit to due process for everybody, including illegals in America, which seemed, I thought, not particularly surprising, but also just worth noting. And then, he had some points where he was just really strong because his argument is so airtight. One of them is he kept hitting her on, you guys are constantly framing these questions in a biased way. You never talk about good stuff. Yeah, I mean, he says it in these hilarious ways. He's like, you never come and you say, Mr. President, everything is doing so great. How are you so great? But his point being that, you're always picking out the worst possible angle to approach this question from. There was a really funny interchange where she says, you know, immigration is now at its lowest ever. And he goes, "Is that a good thing?" Like, he was sort of challenging her to, "Do you think that it should be higher?" And she then sort of flipped that around on him, also interestingly, and saying, "Well, does that mean that this state of emergency that you're claiming is over? That so these powers, these extraordinary powers that you're sort of taking to yourself are no longer justified?" And he said, "No, it's the emergency is the whole situation that was created by the Biden crisis." So many, I thought, rich texts underneath the usual bluster, falderall, and showmanship of just what it is to talk to Trump and how Trump presents himself in the press. But what did you guys think? Was this a win for him?
Well, at the very least, the dolls and pencils stuff, the Trump austerity pitch, which let me interrupt
Yeah,
myself and just say, of all the people in
yeah.
America to start conditioning us for, doing more with less, Trump is quite the candidate.
Look
Um,
at us. Who'd have thought? Look at the two of
the
us. Who'd have thought? Not me.
if there's an analog, there's this to Hakeem Jeffries telling all his members last week, please, dear God, no one go to El Salvador to see Kilmar. And the reaction on the this morning on the Hill from Republicans was, please, Trump, stop talking about the pencil and doll shortage. I suspect Trump will heed the pleas of some of his beleaguered colleagues in the Congress and maybe stay off this line. Yeah, he committed once again to abiding by Supreme Court rulings, which that's like the third or the fourth or the fifth time he's done it. Yeah, I thought I don't know. I mean, I often ponder
Hmm.
like how when I sort of laugh at these sorts of interviews and get slightly indignant at the tone, even of Welker, who, as you said, Spencer, was pretty mild. I like want to port myself back in time to 10 years ago and wonder. what my reaction would be to Trump and Welker in the same interview 10 years ago. So there's definitely this I think we mentioned this maybe last week or the week before. There's certainly this interesting phenomenon that's happened, which is that everyone's just more used to Trump now. So, and even the mainstream media, and so I don't know. It's just this odd phenomenon in America where if you do something often enough from a high enough position of authority and station, that you kind of transform norms generally. So I don't know. It still continues to be very odd to watch Trump in his very Trumpy way engage with the media because it's so sui generis in American public life over in the post-war era. So I found it interesting for that reason alone. I don't think that's a winning economic message. I agree with you, Spencer. I don't know, but he did continually bring what he was trying to lean into his strong suit, which with the public right now is the immigration issue, and do it repeatedly. And so I think that will help him undoubtedly. But this, I mean, the sort of Liberation Day hangover and the whole tariff austerity, tariff as a shadow tax. Who's it going to affect the most? A lot of Trump voters, especially on the bottom quintile or bottom two quintiles of the economic spectrum. I think the jury is still very much out on whether they're going to be able to land this plane soon enough to make it to get what they want in time for the midterm. So that's the main thing that I just remain nervous about because I think losing the Congress will be a disaster for Trump and then a follow-on disaster for the country because the most of the agenda will grind to a halt. So I remain somewhat anxious about that. I don't think he did himself any favors on that front. What will really fix all of that will be a series of trade deals with Japan, with India, maybe with China. Besant is talking with China, I think, this weekend or maybe sooner than that. So we'll see.
Yeah. I think what's interesting about the how many dolls does a child need question is, I mean, it speaks to a deep question that I think undergirds a lot of, Trump's rise, which is there's essentially this value question where America sold its industrial base to China starting in like the mid 90s in exchange for like an endless flow of like Timu products, garbage, like plastic crap. And everybody knows this. Everybody's house is filled with literally just what's that word for the
Langes?
no pH
Phthalates.
yeah,
Yeah,
like everybody's
PHTH.
off gassing phthalates or whatever they are. There's something sick about it. Now, okay, Trump, yeah, it sounds a little weird for him to come out with some kind of crunchy viewpoint on consumerism, but that's essentially what it is. I mean, that's what he's saying. He's like, well, we don't really need as much garbage as we've been buying. Now, I mean, Trump is hardly the guy to be coming out with like a buy nothing principle, but I do feel like that's sort of what's underwriting it. We hear this all the time. Like, maybe it would be okay to have like less stuff, but healthier families or whatever. I mean, you know what the argument is. This kind of
Right.
radcon type of thing. If we could have our own factories building things and our friends and neighbors work in them and then they can afford to buy them and so forth, as opposed to what we have, which is this like bifurcated economy. Regarding the question of the courts, I think Trump is hoping that the Supreme Court is going to do something about these injunctions. I think there's an argument about it this week coming up. I mean, that would be the ideal for the Supreme Court to say, yeah, you can't do universal injunctions against the executive. Like maybe the district courts and circuit courts can't do that. I mean, Congress has passed a law. The House passed a law saying that the courts cannot issue injunctions against presidential actions. I mean, it's not going to pass the Senate, but this is in the air. So hopefully the Supreme Court will deal with it. If they don't, I mean, I guess Trump is going to have to pull a Jackson and just refuse to follow district court injunctions and say it's illegal. It doesn't. I don't know if he'll do that.
Really interesting question. I mean, it's sort of related to what we'll talk about when we get to this Damon Linker piece about the executive, which spoiler sort of lays on at our respective laps the contrived imagined thesis that Trump should be the Pope or something. But we'll deal with it when we get to that. I mean he's itching for some sort of fight on this, and the current court seems well positioned to be favorable toward him. So it hopefully doesn't have to come to what you just described. But yeah, we will see. I wanted to go back though to the point about the dolls that you made, which I thought was really interesting. Like it is this values statement, and yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at when I was saying, like, I think Trump is sort of trying to adjust his pitch, like midair for this. He can tell that he's made a bit of a miscalculation on the like, you don't need so many dolls. That's not quite the right tone to strike, but he seems to be steering it more in the direction of something you just described, which is okay, we have endless cheap disposable goods, but at what cost? What are the sort of unmeasurable values and goods that we're trading away for that? And would it be acceptable, dear American public, to like take a hit on your knockoff brand gunk and kind of make do with an economy that looks a little bit more like it looked sort of before we made this exchange in order to and to me the big question is like what in order to what, like what are the other values that you want to replace this lost Chinese plastic crap with? And is it really just like cheaper gasoline, or is it some, I mean, it seems to be like reshoring, it seems to be jobs, it seems to be reshoring manufacturing capacities, like, but it's all kind of very like there's a little bit of an underpants gnome quality to it right now where it's like we're going to give up the one thing, the cheap Chinese crap, and then something something something, all the factories are going to come back here. And that's the part that is like, I don't know if he's nailed that down yet, but he navigates by feel and he's kind of feeling his way to it.
I mean, one imagines that if there's a demand for things, I mean, we're not talking about building like the most hyper advanced semiconductor companies out of thin air. You know, building company, making factories that can build garbage toys. We could probably still manage that. But you know, I don't really know what the middle step is either.
Can
Uh,
they still make the Power Rangers Zords that each one transform? This is this is what American voters really want to know about: is the ones that it's a robot, but then it transforms into an animal. But then when it also transforms into an animal, the five of them come together and they make one big robot that's made out of all these
sure,
animals. If we can
sure.
make those in America, I'll take bread lines. I'll accept any measure of austerity as long as we can make Hasbro Power Rangers swords.
I think just kind of summing up some of the points we've already discussed. I mean, Trump on China and tariffs on China. Welker asked, "Are you ever going to lower them? Is it just going to be written into the Constitution?" No, he said at some point, "I'm going to lower them because you can actually never do business with them." So that makes sense. I mean, it's kind of Trump's instincts as a businessman. It's what he's done. He's touting, I think, a number 9 trillion in investments coming into this country. I saw not NBC probably did this too, but CBS said, "Oh, well, it's actually not 9 trillion, it's actually more like 2 trillion and then actually another 5 trillion if you count foreign investment." So it's like, okay, I mean, again, we're talking about trillions, so I get that, but I mean, politics, there's so much exaggeration anyway, even before Trump. So, I understand some of the flubs and some of the numbers and everything like that. And this was, of course, reported. I mean, you go to Google, I think on Monday, and put in Donald Trump, Supreme Court, Constitution, and this just came up. Oh my gosh, Trump, wants to violate the Fifth Amendment over and over again. It's like, no, actually, what he's doing is he's not tying his hands. He's not trying to make an argument that says, yes, every illegal immigrant is afforded due process under the Fifth Amendment. Like, this is actually something we need to figure out. And then, as Trump kind of honestly, in many ways, Michael Anton pointed this out a long time ago, like, he's pretty moderate. If the Supreme Court says it, Trump says he's going to follow it. And I don't know. I mean, maybe the second term he's going to be a little bit more radical and, go the Jackson route and say, hey, if, it's your opinion, now enforce it. I'm not sure he's really going to do that at the end of the day. We'll see. We'll see what it really has to do with how fast, how quickly this goes. His nominations. I think he started to talk about judicial nominations. I think even this week, with the midterms coming up. But it's a lot of talk, obviously, with Trump. But I think the midterms do have a big point to what ends up happening, especially with this. And then we'll see what the Supreme Court decides here coming up in these cases.
Yeah, a deadline for sure, but it sounds like we should just turn to this Damon Linker piece because it is directly over this target and will help us, I think, talk through it. Speaking of underpants gnomes, there's this Damon Linker essay in the New York Times, and I'm not calling Damon Linker an underpants gnome, just to be clear. Although, that would be hilarious, but I'm not doing it. I'm just saying that there are a lot of missing steps in this essay. I'm going to try to faithfully represent what Linker is arguing in this effort to link Trump's forceful executive maneuvers back to Carl Schmitt, who's somebody that Trump's critics love to associate him with because A, he is a political philosopher in whom some on the right have an interest, and B, he ended up supporting Adolf Hitler. And so if you link Trump to Schmidt, then you can link him to Hitler, which is, of course, always the gold, the shiny brass ring that guys like this are trying to grab. So Linker starts with Schmidt and writes, for Schmidt, someone must serve in the role of sovereign decider. Legislatures aren't fit for it because they easily devolve into squabbling factions. Neither are administrative bureaucracies because they often defer to established rules and debate without resolution. Both contributed to making the later years of Weimar what Schmidt described in a lecture from 1909 as an age of neutralizations and depoliticization. So this is referring to Schmidt's sort of structural critique of liberalism per se, that leads him to favor a strong executive. This view is then sort of attributed to Leo Strauss. Few on the American right today explicitly credit Schmidt for shaping their views of presidential power. That isn't true of Leo Strauss, the German Jewish emigre from Weimar, who has influenced several generations of conservative academics. Strauss subtly tames Schmidt's views of politics without mentioning him by name and presents them as the pinnacle of political wisdom. I just want to point out, and I'm sorry, I know I said I wasn't going to critique this essay as I go, but the first sentence of this paragraph is that few explicitly credit Schmidt except for Strauss, who never mentioned Schmidt by name. So also, anyway, that's just the editor in me is really wondering who line edited this piece. Then, of course, there is in fact a direct intellectual line from Leo Strauss to Harry Jaffa to the Claremont Institute. So that gets Linker to Russ Vought, and then bizarrely, this is where the underpants gnome part comes in. Something. Adrian Vermeule, a Catholic integralist with whom we have many serious disagreements that we'll get into. But Vermeule, of course, really is a radical in the sense of fundamental critic of liberal democracy and feels that there ought to be a kind of unitary executive and has made this argument quite explicitly in print. So Linker's on safe ground there, wants us to be making the same argument as Vermeule, and then finally gives a sort of potted summary of the Claremont view on American history. He starts out by saying the Claremont Institute has a sort of distinctive view of American history. He then attributes to us views which I think we basically hold, but which are also completely non-distinctive. Like this is the part of the Claremont story that is, I would say, totally identical to basically all American conservatives. Basically, we like the founding, we like Lincoln, we don't like the progressives and the administrative state. All of this is true, but seems a little bit beside the point. And this is why Trump feels that he can rule in a permanent state of emergency. The kind of final the pay dirt here is Trump has declared all these states of emergency, and he has done it because the Claremont Institute has taught him to believe in Carl Schmitt's critique of liberalism. Every part of this seems just like wrong to me, and I find the characterization of each political theorist mentioned really kind of wildly flawed. But I don't want to launch into it any more than I already have. You guys have at it.
It seems to me like, what he says would be fine if we had a healthy system. We have a system of checks and balances where all the three branches are meant to check each other. But what is the check on the judiciary? The only check on the judiciary, realistically speaking, is like reputational. That they don't have.
This is kind of part of Adrian Vermeule's point, I think. Vermeule would probably say that that's kind of how it.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, we have like a critarchy, like a rule by judges. I mean, clearly, seems anti-constitutional. I mean, the Constitution didn't. It mentions lower courts, but it doesn't define them, and it doesn't say that they have the right to overrule the president, like all the time. Um, so I think that there is an emergency because we have these judges just basically legislating from the bench. That's an old phrase, but I mean, making their opinion the law. So as long as that's the case, I really, I mean, I know we just talked about this for the in the other segment, but I don't see how we can avoid some kind of conflict over like these basic matters of how the republic is constituted, because right now it's just running away. So he has to kind of step forward and assert a certain degree of unitary executive power.
Yeah, my frustration with these always is, I know Linker is quite capable of trying to understand us as we understand ourselves, and he gets like 30% there in this piece, and then does what can only be described as I don't want to impute too much motive to him, but it's either lazy or disingenuous judo move where he says, okay, Claremont has this view of constitutional government. With the rise of progressivism in the administrative state, it has betrayed what they think is good about constitutional republicanism, that is, the republicanism of the founders and Lincoln. And then he says, and so their solution, which they're right, Spencer, that's a tortured lineage, which is they're somehow linked to it through Harry Jaffa, Leo Strauss, and back to Schmitt. So they really have provided the theoretical architecture which Trump is obviously operating under, and which Russ Vogt is operating under, which is a Schmittian, uh, whoever is sovereign is the one who gets to decide the exception. That's the kind of one of Schmitt's famous lines. So Trump is doing this grand rule through exception experiment, whereas our interpretation of all of this is no, actually, what we're arguing the modern executive should do and should take steps to do in concert with the Congress would be to restore some popular rule, that is, popular rule by the people through their elected constitutional officers, so that those officers can control and direct this vast field of lawmaking that has been aggregated and seized, really, in many ways, or given over and then expanded and entrenched and ossified in the bureaucracy. So, I mean, our argument is that Trump, in some ways instinctually, but certainly not attributable to Schmitt, but if anything, attributable to an older way of doing constitutional government, wants control over his executive office. What are the things standing in his way? As Seth said, the courts. And then also, a lot of his rule by emergency has been enabled by a progressive minded Congress that is every Congress since the New Deal in some ways, instinctually, and then getting aggressively worse in just how they operate and think about government since at least the 60s and 70s. So it's very confused in that sense. It doesn't draw clear lines of institutional assessment or diagnosis that we've been making for a long time. And look, if you don't like all the emergency stuff, either on tariffs or on Alien Enemies Act or anything else, a Congress that was non-feckless could fix all that overnight. So, his targets are the wrong ones. It's very confusing. I'll put it in the larger context too. Linker has announced on his Substack, he's been sort of teasing this for a long time, but he is writing a book on the students of Strauss or Strauss in American politics, really. And his initial thesis is that how can you have these students of Strauss, on the one hand, these kind of East Coast Straussians, that is the non-Claremont folks, who take a certain detachment from politics, regard democracy ironically, and tend to be pretty anti-Trump. And yet you also have the Jaffaites, who are more involved in mainstream activist conservatism and would now defend someone like Trump in a lot of his various actions. And his provisional conclusion, which he's now going to back up with evidence, I don't mean to say his reasoning's all motivated, but he's come to this conclusion in a lot of his research, is that Strauss, was a critic of liberalism, and but at the same time, he was very subtle and taught his more sophisticated students a certain skepticism of sort of activist government or the limits of politics or any of this. And the Claremont folks only took the critic of liberalism part and have just sort of run with it. So this is why we have the rise of authoritarianism, and it's half the fault of those bad intellectuals at the Claremont Institute. That's more or less, I think, with the argument that he's trying to make. So this New York Times piece it's his nice little drive-by application of his larger thesis to contemporary politics in the first 100 days of the Trump administration.
This just reminds me so much of, right around the Iraq War, you had, New York Times, Washington Post try to do all these connections. Oh my gosh, Strauss is behind this. They're Straussians, Paul Wolfowitz. Like it's just kind of more of the same thing. And Spencer, as you pointed out, I mean that 1 or 2 sentence thing that tells you everything you need to know, kind of about the intellectual, type of work gone into this. I mean, it's shoddy. Like complete lack of evidence is somehow all the evidence you need. It's just crazy. It's like, okay, so the crazy theory of the unitary executive, like all the founders, like George Washington, John Adams, like all these guys had, that's insane. And it's like a simple question too. Like, okay, should the executive be in control of the executive branch or not? He just touts all these like civil servants and this and that. Okay, but no matter it's Trump, really, I mean, Barack Obama, Biden, whomever, shouldn't he actually have control over the branch that, he's ostensibly the head of? Just never asks really just those absolute basic questions. And then too, the connection between Trump and Schmitt. I actually read Clifford Bates, who's a professor over in Eastern Europe. He actually just had kind of a great takedown of this, where he said, "Look, like Schmitt's view of the enemy was like absolutist, rigid. Trump shifts all the time. It's really kind of based on political convenience. Trump's political style is like totally pragmatic, and maybe that's a little bit overstated, but like media driven, which is totally different than Schmitt had a whole ideological conception of this that was, pre kind of practical kind of politics. So really, I mean, that is just really, I think, a poor way at first to understand Trump through Schmittian lens at all. I think Tom West has even said this. I mean, I think it's better to really kind of understand him kind of maybe even like an early progressive politician around the kind of the 19th century. You have the bully pulpit, the rhetoric, which obviously like he can't help, he has that. But that I think is much more in line with kind of American traditions. And then too, we can't just leave it at there as Trump is some early progressive. I mean, clearly he's trying to get back, but the point is he's straddling kind of these two different sides, and he's obviously his instincts, and he's yearning for something. So just on a whole conceptual level, I mean, Damon Linker, I think, has been, not, I mean, he used to be, I think, of the right. I think he was at First Things, but, obviously he's got a bone to pick with the right too, in a larger sense. So that this is just not surprising that this kind of thing is coming from him.
Well, so some Linker history. He actually worked for Mike Anton at Rudy Giuliani's office. Mike's written about this, so I'm not talking out of school. And then Mike helped him get the job at First Things. And then Damon, after working there maybe 9 months, it might have been a little longer, wrote this expose, the Theocons, which we may have mentioned like 18 months ago or 2 or 3 years ago on the podcast, where he basically turned on all of his folks he worked for. This was his turn to the left and cashed out and wrote the tell-all. That's some of Damon's history. I just want to flag, I don't know if Spencer mentioned it, but if anyone wants to find this article, it's called "These Thinkers Set the Stage for Trump, the All-Powerful." I just want to read 2 very short paragraphs, and so I can put a little more flesh on the bones about the extent to which Linker either doesn't understand our argument or is throwing up dust, kicking up dust about it. The presidency has evolved to become an office exercising general and often passive oversight of vast departments and agencies, which are staffed by career civil servants who stay on across administrations. As a result, presidents are constrained by layers of lawyers and others determining what is allowable based on law and precedent. This evolution came about in part because the presidency can be the office most susceptible to despotic or tyrannical rule. Now, the founders' view was that the legislature was the main problem, as they experienced it throughout the Articles of Confederation, state legislatures, et cetera, running rampant over the people's rights. And so they created this powerful executive to be a check on the legislature. Now, granted, they were certainly wise to the risks of a large executive branch having thrown off the king, but it's the modern progressive argument, which is parroted here by Linker, and you've seen it in some of these recent books which I've mentioned before, whenever I mention it, Spencer has a small stroke ungoverning this book I've mentioned a bunch of times. But really, what progressives want is they want this large administrative state, and their argument for it in part is that the separation of powers, which used to mean the Congress checking the executive and the judicial branch checking both, but the judicial branch being constrained by the manner in which they hear cases and controversies, very narrow, and really confining themselves to being umpires on the question of constitutionality and supreme law when it came to them. The modern progressive alternative is really to import the separation of powers into the executive branch. And that makes a certain sense because the progressive argument was the separation of powers sucks. We can't get anything done. We can't have expert administrative rule. So what we really need to do is have all these disinterested folks exercising both judicial, or all three, judicial, executive, and legislative power in the executive branch. And so, if with that whole arrangement, that sort of anti-constitutional arrangement that's been growing and metastasizing since the turn of the 20th century, and especially since the 60s and 70s, with that all being the case, if you're a progressive and you want to preserve all those policies that came out of that, of course, your only solution is to have something like the system we have. So any president trying to overturn a bunch of that, reconstitutionalize the administrative state, restore the older separation of powers, is somehow a Schmittian authoritarian. So that's about where we are.
Oof, I mean, there are a few things I have. Okay, let me try to be as charitable as possible and say that I think the most interesting part of this whole argument is that the perennial state of emergency really is a problem for Trump and for his supporters who want, as we do, to claim and to be on the side of constitutional Republican rule of law. And this falls for me into the bucket that we've kind of been in a couple times on this podcast, which is that when you begin from a condition of extreme constitutional deformity, some of the measures you take to return to constitutional normalcy will themselves have an element of constitutional abnormality, or I mean emergency is the word. And so then you do end up in this difficult and delicate position. Now, the problem here is that Linker has like completely misrepresented, as you've just described, Ryan, the justification and the reasons and all everything that I just said, and the way that we tend to talk about how this stuff works is just like not captured in this piece. Starting with, I just don't think this is the right reading of Schmitt. I mean, I know that Schmitt is the big bad Nazi guy, and that we're not supposed to read him carefully. And I myself am not a Schmittian, but Schmitt's idea of the problem with liberalism and with legislatures is not, as Linker seems to claim, that they are incapable of making decisions or deciding between friend and enemy. It's that they are always already deciding between friend and enemy tacitly while maintaining a facade of neutrality, which is a much, whatever else you want to say about it, is a much more interesting and powerful sort of critique, and much more recognizably connected to, for instance, the work of a Patrick Deneen or an Adrian Vermeule. Then, when we arrive at the Strauss of it all, it's true, I think, that Strauss was influenced by Schmitt, but his argument is very, very different. And there is some truth, I think, to Linker's representation of Strauss sets out a timeless moral standard of what is intrinsically good or right in normal situations as the just allocation of benefits and burdens in society. But there are also extreme situations, those in which the very existence or independence of a society is at stake. In such situations, the normally valid rules of natural right are revealed to be changeable, permitting office holders to do whatever is required to defend citizens against possibly an absolutely unscrupulous and savage enemy. Now, it's not the case that Strauss thinks the rules of natural right are changeable. He's a prudentialist, and he thinks that navigating within those rules or according to those lights might end you up with exceptional situations where you do things differently than the usual principle. But the more important thing here that just goes completely unmentioned is that considering yourself justified to do whatever is required to defend citizens against possibly an unscrupulous and savage enemy describes nothing so much as the response to Trump, especially in the lead up to his reelection. I mean, this is like to a T the description of explicit arguments that were made again and again about Trump, that he was such an extraordinary foe that we needed to be able to bend the norms and rules of justice and right action so that we could get him out of public life. Any sort of critique of, I don't know, Straussians or Schmittians or whatever on this score just has to engage with that fact, right? Like, has to set the context that somehow you have to account for the fact that, like, an extreme state of no holds barred, all bets are off emergency has just been declared in order to remove one man from public life, the man who is now president. You may say that that was entirely justified, but you can't then turn around and say that, like, it's a problem that he's, I think, rather delicately attempting now to, like, right the ship of state. Anyway, I'm going on for too long about this because I just find, I find this part of it, the unmentioned, just giant elephant in the room, that the Schmittian state of emergency was already declared against Trump. And the fact that that is nowhere mentioned in this piece is just, like, kind of baffling to me. I guess it's not all that baffling. Anyway, we should touch on, before we go, we should touch on this Shiloh Hendricks situation.
I'll
Um,
just drop. Let
yeah,
me just drop a footnote to Aristotle, Spencer, because
yeah.
Strauss did like to discuss that passage in the Ethics, Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle talks about political right and natural right, and he basically, more or less, to paraphrase, in things political, natural right is always and everywhere changeable. Now, he didn't mean that there isn't such a thing as natural justice that's transhistorical. What he meant was basically what you said, which is prudence will necessitate some extreme measures or adaptations as you try to navigate the twisting turns of governing. And then the last thing is just that the famous place in Natural Right and History where Strauss talks about extreme measures, there's this wonderful phrase where he kind of is musing about this problem of the Soviet Union and a monstrous tyranny that we're arrayed against as a country. And he says, it may sometimes be the case that even a liberal democracy at home will have to use some of the totalitarian tools of its enemy in order to prevent itself from being exterminated. I'm, hackishly saying what Strauss did. And this is just a fact of political life. It's an ugly fact of political life. It's why we have a presidency that's rather large and can respond to emergencies. And then Strauss, with his usual moderation, says, but the rest of that discussion we shall leave behind the veil with which it is justly covered. And then he moves on to another subject.
Nah.
Anyway, just my brief for reading Strauss. It's wonderful. And if you, any Strauss, incipient Strauss fans out there, if you want to start somewhere, go to Natural Right and History or one of the collected essays books. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
No, point completely taken. And it's funny. You're absolutely right. And as I was saying that, Ryan, I was thinking, well, I guess it is sort of the case. And Aristotle thinks you need to maintain a wide latitude for, like, fungibility here. And what I'm really thinking now is, like, this is all of this is why you need Aquinas, which Strauss is also pretty good on. But, like, Aquinas, his whole sort of fourfold distinction of the law is kind of designed to make the distinction between, like, divine law, which never changes and is eternal, and human law, which is, again, I'm going to butcher this, but, like, that we are navigating in light of an ineffable and therefore never fully systematizable eternal truth, which is then going to cash out in different ways at different times. Also, Churchill's essay on consistency in politics is really good here. And now we really have to talk about Shiloh Hendricks, because the people want to hear about it. So, okay, this woman in Minnesota, Shiloh Hendricks, allegedly was in the playground with her kid when another kid came up and took something out of her diaper bag. And then she called this kid the N word. Some versions of the story have her also physically menacing the kid in some way, or I don't know, maybe just shoving the kid away from the diaper bag or something, something, something. Whereupon the Mark Omar, a man who was at the playground too with his kid, not the father of either children involved directly in this altercation, takes out his phone and starts filming for the account at Sea Racists, and basically starts goading Hendricks into saying the N word. Again, you're going to call a kid that? Would you call a kid that? Did you call this child that? And Hendricks kind of takes the bait. I mean, she's basically trying to get out of there, but she says, yeah, if you're acting that way, I'm going to call you that. And sure, if the kid is acting that way, I'll call him that. And, she's like, on her way out, she basically gives him the video that he wants. Whereupon, completely in keeping with this genre of griftery, Omar says, "Well, I can't believe that she would call a kid an N-word," as if he hadn't just been prompting her to do exactly that in the most aggressive possible fashion. But she does in fact basically say that on camera. It seems plausible that she said it also off camera. Cancel culture ensues. I mean, basically, there's a huge campaign to harm this woman's child, to find out where she lives, to identify her. But the twist, I guess, if there is one, is that she then takes to the internet to say, "I'm being pursued, persecuted for this video. Can you please help me financially?" Starts a Give, Send, Go campaign, which is basically like GoFundMe, but for people that are outside of the risk getting kicked off of GoFundMe. Last I checked, she's raised like $700,000. So this woman may basically become a millionaire from this exchange, which is a totally new chapter to a story with which we are all now extremely familiar. And I guess the only other thing that makes this one particularly sticky news wise is that, unlike some other cancel culture situations where you think the person did basically nothing wrong, this is one in which most people seem to agree Shiloh Hendricks was, to begin with, behaving badly. So it's, I guess, of the flavor of cancel culture story that is not, oh, nobody should have to apologize for this at all, but rather the response to this is wildly out of proportion from the kind of moderate social chastisement that it probably should merit. On the video, Omar says something like, that's a hate crime and you can get reported for that. Incredibly weird Stalinist like mumbling, especially since I don't think that's true. This is America. He sort of seems to think he's like in England or something. Anyway,
Or Somalia.
and also or but eminently possible. And then the other part of it is that like people did, as part of the first wave of reaction, try to get her arrested or to have action taken against her. What have you guys made of all this? It's been a kind of I find it to very much be a sort of a vibe shift sort of story. There's lots of moving parts, so you tell me what you think.
I mean, I find the whole thing so depressing, like
Yeah.
elevating this obnoxious woman. Okay, I mean, I get it. Like saying like racial epithets shouldn't destroy your life and get you debanked or fired or shunned or insulted on the internet necessarily. But at the same time, is like screaming the N word at like an 8-year-old. Is that like heroic behavior?
No, it's terrible behavior. It's absolutely dreadful, crass, lowbrow behavior. What
Totally.
it is above all is like low class and
Very
and
low
and
class.
uncouth, right? And so this is the part of it actually that's particularly interesting to me, is that like this genre, this most sordid of all American genres, which is a product uniquely of the internet age, consists precisely in prodding sort of ill-bred and ill-mannered people to behave in ill-bred and ill-mannered ways that also intersect with disfavored racial categories, right? It's like the unique blend of being the wrong race at the wrong time and also being a sort of unpalatable human being just makes you basically like the lowest cased human it's possible to be, like an untouchable, right? And so this is it's like a new version of the old problem of this sort of despicable person whose free speech I nevertheless defend. And so it now falls for me into the category of like, what did you expect, which is a very, very large category where we've created the situation in which, one race especially, and many races in general, are allowed racial hatred, right? Like black and brown people by POC are sort of anointed according to a particular view of American life to express any level of racial contempt and hatred. Whereas
Or group
other,
solidarity.
yeah, or group
The
solidarity, right?
others.
Exactly. Whereas white people can't even wander unawares and unintentionally into sort of racially adjacent territory without fear of being hounded out of their jobs and given death threats. And as many people have said in the wake of this whole episode, it's like, it just doesn't work like that. You are either going to attempt the radical American experiment of like not grouping yourself by race and not like anointing or accepting certain racial grievances, or you're just going to open the giant snake pit called like racial animus that has produced a significant portion of the world's conflict, and then people are going to like, that's a really ugly box.
You know
And
what's
so
funny?
now, yeah.
The other day, I heard, I don't know why I was listening to this, like the president of Singapore was giving a speech because they're having elections and some outside group is trying to convince the Muslims all to vote as a bloc. And the president of Singapore was like, look, this is despicable. He's like, our greatest strength is and I was expecting him to say diversity. He said, no, our greatest strength is our unity. And we cannot let ourselves become riven by racial considerations, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this is what happens in a country that praises diversity and elevates certain groups in these ways is and having a reaction against it was entirely predictable. Like if you want to create a white racial consciousness, which wasn't really that profound in America, like outside of like, I don't know, Klan meetings, then go ahead and just vilify whites all you can, and then you're going to coalesce them into feeling this way. And this is like the predictable and depressing outcome. I don't know. I mean, yeah, you're right about like the tabloids used to be filled with just the trashiest, grossest stuff
Yeah.
going on in the country, like woman pees on the floor in Burger King. And now this is all this is media. This is all we see all day long.
It reminds me so vividly of the COVID era when you would have all these viral videos where people had nothing better to do than to like chase each other around, screaming at each other in grocery stores for some minor infraction that they had basically provoked. It was like, oh, you're going to take off your mask. You're going to take off your mask. And then somebody would take off his mask and like start screaming hysterically because we were all at like the fever pitch of emotion all the time. And everybody was maximally high strung in every public setting for reasons that were completely understandable and had been stoked intentionally by the most powerful people in the world. And then it was like, oh, look at this person behaving badly. Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly grotesque. And the only thing I can say about it is like Matt Walsh kind of made this point. If this is like the ugly end of an ugly era, then it might be acceptable, right? If this is just the like final definitive statement, yes, even this
Dream on.
extremely distasteful woman, right? Yeah, exactly. But of course, right? It seems sort of like an escalation. I don't know.
Yeah. Also, the other context which comes up, there's this sort of insane panel commissioned by Piers Morgan on his show with this woman Lily Gaddis, who's gotten internet famous for defending the woman at the park, Shiloh. Mark Lamont Hill, who's how would you call him? I guess center left, Seth, or just left?
He's pretty left.
Yeah, pretty left. Black online commentator. Myron Gaines, who I kind of seen around on the internet, but I don't really know precisely what he does. He's an internet vidcaster, and he's black, but he's Sudanese, and so it's clear on this panel considers himself somewhat apart from the traditional African American community in the country. And then some woman from the New York Post. And what comes out of all of this is the bigger context, which Mark Lamont Hill brings up, which is like, look, let's look at these two. It's part of this larger argument about the virtues and vices of this woman being able to raise a lot of money to defend herself, which is the kid who stabbed the black kid who stabbed the white kid and killed him in Plano, Texas, a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago. Him and his family also raising money through GoFundMe, the more traditional thing. And Mark Lamont's Hill point is like, look, these things are different. This woman's racist. It's terrible. And basically all the people giving her money are just racist, and they like that she's a racist, and that's why they're giving her money. Whereas Carmelo's case, basically what they're raising money for is to get a fair trial, because he claims it was self-defense, and all these people are giving him money to fund his trial for self-defense. And I'm sorry, the more complicated argument is on both sides of both these fundraising things. there's a mix of all the people. There's the racial solidarists, and then there's also the people who are just fed up with their tribe being maligned, or getting special privileges or being aggrieved, and are giving out of racial solidarity. And a lot of us who've been arguing against this way of doing national politics have said for a long time, and actually in many ways been reluctant to put it in print because you don't want to accelerate it. But look, if we're going to do national civil rights law this way, if we're going to racialize everything in our politics, then the one group that has really avoided that, at least for 40 years, and has always been told, no, you are the one group that cannot do this, that is whites, they're going to start saying, well, screw this. I mean, if this is the system, then we're going to defend our people. So that's at play here too. And that's not at all a defense of the unfortunate and rude and crass behavior of Shiloh at the park, but that the larger argument that this has raised, which was, you mentioned Matt Walsh, Spencer, we should say he just did a monologue on this, basically saying this is not simply the case of some racist white lady getting rewarded for her racism. This is the wages of doing politics in this racialized way for 30 or 40 years. And so I'm defending the fact that she's raising money to defend herself against what's going to come from all this, either legally or in terms of securing her family and her house against doxing and all the rest. And that's all on display and at various points in this panel on Piers Morgan's show. And so anyway, it's worth watching. It's one of the more insane 50 minutes of television I've ever seen in my life. I was joking with the guys ahead of time. It's like a weird mix of old 90s reality TV when they'd have weird, fringy racists or anti-Semites on, or even black nationalists on, combined with Crossfire, combined with Piers Morgan's normal show. And it kind of goes totally off the rails, and basically ends with Mark Lamont Hill screaming so much that his camera is shaking as he, after Piers Morgan told the girl Lily Gaddis, well, okay, you think you should have free speech and you've said you're comfortable using the N-word, well, say it now. And Mark Lamont Hill completely loses it and says,
he looks as though his head is about to explode like a grenade. It is truly like just the whole thing is I mean, I just wanted to say before we probably have to shut this podcast down as they say, but the introduction of crowdfunding into this entire dynamic, which basically creates a situation where economic incentives are attached to various forms of like not just bad behavior, but attention seeking and kind of like the the most grotesque spectacle you can make of yourself. Like if you pee on if you pee in public in a McDonald's, you get $5. But if you vomit in the street outside of an Arby's, you get 10. It's like Karl Marx would have had a field day. This is like, the best argument you could possibly make against sort of like weaponized universal capitalism without any restraint. Anyway,
One thing, what's funny is I went to CPAC a few years ago, like in Dallas. I remember waiting on a long line to get into the event or whatever, and the people in front of me had just started. They were the owners of Give Send Go, and it was interesting. We had a long conversation about it. It had just started. They hadn't really gotten anywhere yet. They were like, "Oh, we're the alternative. We're the conservative alternative to whatever the other one is." Whatever. It was just they've really gone places now.
they sure have. Yes. And like, I mean, 99% of the campaigns, I'm sure, on both of these websites are completely anodyne or even admirable and virtuous. But this particular dimension of it has really become extremely Hunger Games. Speaking of hopefully slightly better cultural objects and items than the genre we've been discussing, does anybody have any recommendations to close us out that is not like a TikTok video of a woman using a racial slur?
I've got one, which is just we are now rereading, because my wife and I at different times read it, when they first came out, just for social cultural reasons, among other things. We're reading Harry Potter to Albert, and if you hear him, Albert's in the room. And I just want to this was Amelia's point. She's entering the podcast again.
There you go.
She's been reading it a little more to Albert than I have, although I find it enjoyable too, because I enjoyed the books back when I was 22 or whatever it was. But you can understand why J.K. Rowling became a billionaire. I mean, she just has a wonderful narrative style for let's call it like 6 to 18-year-olds, or especially maybe 6 to 14-year-olds. Very compelling, wonderful voices, in your head, obviously, because you're reading a book, colorful characters. There's kind of something there for everyone, and just delightful experience. Even though they are, I will acknowledge, for those familiar with all the books and their increasing kind of darkness as it rolls through. We're all now on what book are we on, Albert? 4? Yeah. We're now on book 4. A little advanced for a 6-year-old.
I like the
I
part
have
where
one.
Ron dead names the transsexual that's trying to use the women's bathroom.
Oh, wait, no.
Well, I have a recommendation. I just read, or I'm almost finished with, and I never read it before, the autobiography of Malcolm X. It's a really interesting book. I mean, it's fun to read, but what I kind of gathered, and I like looked at his speeches and read about him and stuff, I had always kind of had this impression. Okay, on one side you've got Martin Luther King, who is like the apostle of like Gandhian nonviolence, and on the other side you have Malcolm X, who's like this militant. But in fact, he wasn't very militant. The whole time he was in the Nation of Islam, he was under instructions not to engage in any kind of protests or anything like that. And then afterward, like during the long hot summer of '64 with all the riots, he was in Mecca for most of it. I mean, he would urge blacks to like, unite to do self-defense. He would say we have the right to defend ourselves, and that's kind of what he meant when he said by any means necessary. He was really he never advocated for violence. He wasn't like some kind of like proto Black Panther. And by the time he died, he was on the way to this whole like color, like he said, color blindness is the only way. So it's very interesting the use of Malcolm X, whose centenary is next week.
Yeah.
Which okay, for instance, like there's that famous picture of him holding a rifle and looking out the window.
Yeah.
And people take that to be like, oh, wow, he's like, but all he was doing, he was just worried that the Nation of Islam was going to come and murder him.
So who's the person that like is who people think Malcolm X is?
Like Stokely Carmichael, or one of like, one of the Black Panthers who were like crazy. Like they were like, actual murderers.
And the Denzel movie kind of cultivated that image a little more than sounds like the autobiography did.
Little bit. Well, that was Spike Lee's doing, but that's kind of the image that I'd had. But it's really not that. What Malcolm X really liked to do, his favorite thing to do was to go to colleges and universities and like have like long debate sessions with like grad students and professors.
Yeah.
He's like the Black Ben Shapiro.
Well, except sure.
So it was literally five papers, essays. Was like
mutatis mutandis.
All right, nice.
Let me just plug Spencer. There's this great winter issue 2011-2012 CRB essay by Diana Schaub called "Solve for X," which is kind of a skillful compare and contrast essay on Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X by Diana Schaub. And Seth, she comes to basically your conclusion in a way, which is to say Malcolm X was a truer American, like in the founder's sense, than Martin Luther King Jr. So provocative thesis, and go check it out if you want. Just search "Solve for X," Schaub, SCHAUB, and you'll find it.
And there's another essay too. It's the Heritage Foundation. They used to have a first principles essay. Peter Myers wrote a really long piece. I think it was comparing and contrasting Malcolm X to Martin Luther King Jr. So that's another really good one. Peter's done great work on Frederick Douglass. I think that's his main kind of work. For me, I don't even think I've watched like any shows since last week at all. So I'm still very early on in the Pacific. One book I'm reading, kind of an academic history, England's Second Reformation. So it's like 1610 to 1662, the Great Ejection, basically coming back of royalism. So it's a great book by English historian Anthony Milton. Very, very well done, based in primary resources. I mean, it's amazing, just the kinds of things he brings to the table. And then just some of the things he punctures, especially like around kind of the Westminster Confession of Faith, which was 1646. And just kind of punctures this kind of, just like in, our politics and everywhere, these easy kind of dichotomies, like oh, the Puritans versus the conformists and this and that. It's like, no, it's actually a lot more fluid than that. The Puritans and conformists actually had quite a bit of theological agreement. You look at the 39 Articles, you look at, which was this is an anachronism, an Anglican Confession of Faith. That word wasn't around at that point, but it's really kind of a model for how to do history.
Cool. That sounds great. So I have a problem in my life, which is that I just always feel like I don't like classical music as much as I'm supposed to. It seems like somebody like with my sort of profile and interests and hobbies should just be a huge classical music nerd listening to Brahms on vinyl and just really, relishing the subtle differences between Bach and Beethoven. But in this way, I'm totally brain rotted. I like the pop music of my childhood. I like the jazz standards that my dad played me growing up, and I have a really hard time getting into classical music. I think part of it is that you can't really listen to it in the background. You have to actually treat it like a movie or something. And so it's just a area of high art that has an incredibly high degree of like activation energy required for me, and it makes me sympathize when people tell me that they can't get into reading when I try to. Every now and then I just decide I'm gonna get into classical music and I'm gonna listen to a history of music. And I'm gonna kind of like explore all these Spotify playlists and whatever. And I never, when I sit down at the end of the day or when I'm putting something on while I'm proofreading, I just never end up being able to choose something classical. And so this is like sad for me. But however, I went last night to the Nashville Symphony Orchestra. We have a really good Philharmonic Orchestra here in Nashville, and they do an annual suggested donation concert to support their enterprise with volunteer musicians and singers. And I thought, okay, well, we'll go to this. And we went out and they played Gustav Mahler's Second Symphony, which everything I'm about to tell you about this is completely something I grokked in the chair while I was wait. I know nothing about this history. I just asked Grok to tell me kind of like what's Mahler's place in music history. Basically, it told me that he's a sort of transitional figure in between like high Wagnerian German Gesamtkunstwerk and some of the more modern stuff that was coming down the pike in the 20th century. Um, and the Second Symphony is the resurrection symphony that arose out of his response to his friend's death. It includes a choral bit at the end, which was kind of innovative for the time. I don't know. Sometimes I guess you're just like in the zone, and I actually managed to put my phone away for the entire time. I didn't check it once while they went through this like 90-minute piece, and it was a great performance. They did a great job. It was a good performance. I don't think that this is like necessarily the greatest piece of Western music ever composed. It's got some really interesting parts in it, but something about it just I was ready for it. Like I was ready to meet Mahler where he was at. And it was a trip, man. I mean, it was like such a profound emotional roller coaster of an experience. Mahler is working out incredibly complicated ideas that you can like feel directly in the music. Anyway, this is not necessarily to say you should listen to Mahler's Second Symphony, although there are great recordings of it online. But just like if you've got a local orchestra, even a okay one, do yourself a favor and like give it another shot. See if they have a concert available, and like, put your phone away and just like scrub your brain clean with some classical music, even if, like me, it's not really your thing. Yes, it's worth the activation energy. Okay, that's all the time we have. We're way over time. Thank you all very much for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to know more about all the work we do at the Claremont Institute and not just take it from Damon Linker's essay in the New York Times, you can visit our websites and get it straight from the horse's mouth at ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, AmericanMind.org, and Claremont.org. You can also visit our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org, and you can donate to support our work at claremont.org/donate. Thanks very much to our production and engineering crew, the Brothers G, Jake and Ryan Gannon. If you want to particularly support this podcast, you can rate, review, share, subscribe, give us 5 stars, tell your mom, text your group chat, however you spread the word. We would be very grateful for you to do so. And thanks very much to all of you for listening. We will talk to you next week.